I was 51 when my life tore open, not with drama or spectacle, but with the quiet, undeniable force of something true finally refusing to stay buried. At that age, you believe you've already faced the largest storms of your life. The loss of a parent, the strain of a failing marriage, the long hours of a career that demands more than it returns. I thought I had already survived the worst. I was wrong. I had been living in a modest suburb outside Denver for almost a decade. The neighborhood was quiet in the way aging communities often are. Muted lawns, slow dog walkers, cars that looked the same year after year. My house was simple, functional, and, like me, more tired than worn. After my father's funeral 8 years earlier, the silence of that home became something I learned to accept. I worked long hours, traveled often, and convinced myself the stillness was a comfort rather than a reminder of how empty life could become when family fractures. That night, though, had felt strangely normal. I just wrapped a 3-month investigation into a corrupted zoning deal. Another case full of half-truths, bribed inspectors, missing documents, and men who shook my hand while hiding knives behind their backs. The kind of work that ages you faster than birthdays do. My colleagues insisted on buying dinner to celebrate. I went along because declining would have raised more questions than I felt like answering. The restaurant was warm, crowded, full of the slow burn of bourbon and the crisp smell of grilled salmon carried through the air. Someone at the bar laughed too loudly. A server dropped a tray of glasses. These small human noises felt oddly distant to me, as if I were listening to them through a thick window pane. The table was full of chatter, half-finished stories, and the tired adrenaline of people who had worked too hard for too long. I nodded when expected, smiled politely, let my eyes drift to the dark reflection in the window beside me. That reflection didn't look like the version of myself I carried in my head. The man staring back had lines carved deeper than I remembered. He looked like someone waiting for something to break, though I couldn't say what. Maybe myself. We had just finished dessert, some oversweet chocolate tort I barely tasted, when my phone vibrated. The screen lit up in a way that pulled my attention immediately. A midnight call. Unknown number. I would normally ignore it. Late-night calls never bring anything good. But the screen displayed something else beneath the number, as if a message was embedded in the call itself. A video. I felt the shift in my chest before I even touched the phone. Some subtle, instinctive tightening, as though my body recognized something my mind had not yet processed. The people around me continued talking, unaware that something inside me had gone still. I tapped the screen. The restaurant noise fell away from my awareness, thinning into a kind of dull echo. The video opened in a burst of grainy light. At first I saw only motion, shaking, uneven, as if the person holding the camera couldn't keep their hand steady. Then the image steadied just enough. A man's face filled the frame. Older, gray hair unkempt, eyes wide with a kind of fear I hadn't seen since childhood. Lips trembling as if he'd been speaking before the recording started. My hand went cold. The fork I'd been holding slipped from my fingers, landing against the plate with a sharp clatter that made someone at the table flinch. Couldn't be. It wasn't possible. But every instinct in me recognized him before my thoughts dared to. My father. 8 years dead. Yet there he was, staring at me through a flickering video sent from a number that didn't exist in my contacts. A number I had never seen before. His face wasn't the way I remembered it last. Not the peaceful softness of the funeral home, not the forced calm of the hospital. This version of him looked worn, frightened, as though life, not death, had dragged years across him. His mouth moved again, and the audio caught up just enough to carry a broken rasp of breath. I stood abruptly. Someone asked if I needed air. Someone else joked about my dessert disagreeing with me. I didn't answer. I pushed my chair back, walked out of the restaurant, and only when the cold Denver night air hit my face did I realize I had been holding my breath. The video continued playing as I stood on the sidewalk. Streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. Cars passed in slow intervals, oblivious to the unraveling in my hands. The man, my father, leaned closer to the camera. His face blurred, then sharpened again. His eyes looked directly into mine, desperate, pleading. Then he spoke my name. Not the full version. Not what colleagues or acquaintances called me. He used the shortened form, the one only he ever used, the one tied to childhood bike rides, late-night talks in the garage, quiet mornings after the worst arguments of my teenage years. Hearing it again felt like being struck. My throat constricted. My vision narrowed. The cold air thickened, as if the night itself had paused to listen. He said my name again, strained, breathless. And in that moment, the ground beneath the life I thought I understood gave way. Not cleanly, not violently. More like an old foundation finally admitting it could no longer carry the weight placed upon it. I tried to speak into the phone, but the video ended abruptly, cutting to black as though someone had yanked it away mid-breath. The call disconnected. Silence settled heavily around me. If the dead were calling the living, then whatever I had believed about grief, about closure, about the finality of a grave, had been nothing but a thin wall standing between me and a truth waiting to break through. And the truth, I would soon learn, was far worse than death. In the days that followed, life behaved as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Morning traffic still moved in its sluggish rhythm down County Line Road. My office lights still flicked on with the same dim hum. People passed my desk offering the same polite greetings, unaware that something inside me had splintered. Outwardly, I moved through each routine on autopilot, but internally, it felt as though my lungs had learned a new kind of tightness. One that came not from panic, but from being watched by a truth I didn't yet understand. I tried to convince myself the video had been some cruel manipulation. Deepfake technology, stolen images, illusion. I repeated those explanations in my head like a man reciting a prayer he didn't quite believe in. But memory has its own stubborn logic. My father had a way of speaking my name that no algorithm could replicate, a tone that carried years of quiet understanding and disappointment. I had heard that tone again. 8 years after standing at his grave, I had heard it again. The world around me began to tilt in ways most people wouldn't notice. Not at first. The first sign was small. A cousin I rarely spoke to suddenly stopped answering my texts. Another canceled lunch without rescheduling. Then, invitations stopped arriving altogether, birthdays, barbecues, the small family gatherings that keep people loosely tethered. At first, I blamed myself. Work had distanced me. Grief had made me harder to reach. But the silence grew too deliberate, too synchronized to be coincidence. Even family group chats, normally chaotic chains of jokes and photos, continued without me, as if someone had quietly removed my number from the list. My name would appear only when assigning chores for holiday meals, never for conversation. It had the unmistakable weight of exclusion, delivered so politely it became impossible to confront without sounding paranoid. I told myself I was reading too much into things. But loneliness has a way of sharpening perception rather than dulling it. And I could feel something shifting, something unspoken, something that seemed to hum just beneath the surface of every polite interaction. Attention I couldn't yet define. Around the same time, I began asking questions about my father, subtle ones at first. I asked an aunt whether he ever mentioned any unfinished business before he died. She changed the subject. I asked my uncle if he knew whether my father had traveled anywhere unusual in his final months. He mumbled something vague and excused himself. I asked my brother Noah whether he remembered Dad ever talking about a safety deposit box, a private document, anything that might explain the video. Noah told me I was working too hard. Then he smiled too tightly, the way someone smiles when they know more than they are willing to share. Their silence felt orchestrated. The more I asked, the less they answered, and the more isolated I became in the one family that should have tethered me in my confusion. I had never felt particularly close to them, but this was different. This was withdrawal, slow, calculated, careful. Thanksgiving came and went without a single message from anyone. Christmas followed the same way. Even my mother's older sister, the one person who used to check in on me, sent a short, clipped text wishing me strength. That was all. No explanation. No invitation. It was as though a circle had formed around something they all refused to speak about, and I had been placed firmly outside of it. Meanwhile, the image from that midnight call etched itself into the back of my thoughts. My father's trembling face. his eyes wide with fear, darting toward something just outside the frame. The way his breath had rasped my name as if calling for help. Sometimes I replayed the video in the dark of my living room, volume low, the glow of the screen casting long shadows across the floor. I examined every pixel, pausing on each blurred frame, hoping to find some sign of forgery. Distorted edges, mismatched lighting, unnatural movements. But the image held its truth with unsettling confidence. 8 years. 8 long years since I watched them lower his coffin into the grave. And now, the distance between me and the rest of the family grew so stark it became a kind of quiet hostility. My father's old farmhouse in Ohio, a place built board by board with his own hands, was quietly transferred to Noah. No discussion, no consideration. A cousin informed me by accident, assuming I already knew. I didn't. When I called Noah about it, he sounded inconvenienced, as if I were interrupting something important. He said Dad must have made changes before dying, then hung up before I could question him further. The explanation didn't make sense. My father had been meticulous about dividing things fairly. Before he died, he told me the property was to be split evenly between us. But paperwork moved quickly after funerals, and I had been too consumed by grief to watch closely. That failure now sat heavily on my conscience. When I checked the county records online, I found nothing, no documents, no transfers, no archives. As if the change had been smoothed over, the digital trail erased and rewritten. Bureaucracies are sloppy. They leave fingerprints everywhere. Yet this looked clean, too clean. Around this time, my sleep began breaking into fragments. I'd wake at 2 or 3 in the morning without knowing why, heart racing, as though caught between 2 worlds. One where my father was dead, and another where he was trying to reach me through the static. I told no one about the video. Not yet. I didn't trust anyone enough to expose that fracture. Not when every instinct warned me I was being watched, measured. Even. The loneliness didn't come as a wave but as a slow freezing, spreading across the parts of me that once trusted family ties to hold. I found myself eating dinners alone more often, cereal or reheated leftovers in a dimly lit kitchen. The silence in the house grew heavier. I began working later at the office not because I had to, but because being around other people, even in superficial ways, kept me from drowning in the weight of questions. One evening, after a long day of pretending my life was still intact, I sat at my desk staring at the same unfinished report for almost an hour. I couldn't focus, couldn't shake the sense that something larger than I understood was unfolding behind my back. Everything felt orchestrated. The exclusions, the evasions, the transfer of property, the missing documents, the unreturned calls, and beneath all of it, the face of my father calling my name in the dark. If grief had been a quiet companion before, it was now a warning, a signal that something long hidden was beginning to surface. I didn't know what truth waited behind that rising silence, only that my family was determined to keep me from reaching it. But isolation, real isolation, does something unexpected, pushes you inward, sharpening your resolve, clarifying your instincts. And somewhere inside that growing quiet, I felt the first hint of determination settling into me. If no one would speak, then I would find answers on my own. Whatever my father had tried to tell me in that midnight call, whatever fear lived behind his trembling eyes, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Something was wrong, and it had been wrong long before the video arrived. The moment the first real fracture appeared, it didn't come with shouting or accusations. It arrived the way serious betrayals often do, quietly, through paperwork written in the detached language of institutions. No emotion, no explanation, just signatures and dates arranged in a way that told me my life had been altered without my consent. It was a cold Thursday morning when I finally gathered enough nerve to look again at my father's financial records. I hadn't touched them since the funeral, not out of avoidance exactly, but because I assumed everything had been handled properly. My father had always been structured to a fault. He labeled boxes in his attic, color-coded documents, even arranged his wrench set by frequency of use. It seemed impossible that anything in his estate could be mishandled. And yet, after the video, I could no longer rely on that assumption. I sat in my small home office, the one with the single narrow window overlooking the quiet street. The room smelled faintly of old paper and dust, the scent of things left untouched for too long. I opened the folder labeled Dad, Retirement and Accounts. I expected to see balance sheets, maybe an outdated beneficiary form, something harmless. Instead, I found the first undeniable violation. The account, his primary retirement fund, one he had paid into steadily for 3 decades, had been transferred entirely to Noah. Not partially, entirely. The paperwork was immaculate. Notarized, processed, stamped by the county. But the more I looked at the signature, the more something in my chest tightened. The looping curve of the R in his name was wrong. Too smooth, too quick. My father had arthritis toward the end. His writing had developed a subtle tremor. This signature had none of that. I flipped through page after page, each one worsening the quiet nausea spreading through me. Dates didn't line up. Clauses were altered. There were corrections in fine print that I knew my father never would have approved. And tucked near the back was a guardianship note, one stating that I had declined involvement in the estate. I never declined anything. I sat back in my chair, staring at the page as though it were written in a language I didn't recognize. My father's handwriting, careful and deliberate, had been replaced by something else, something manufactured. Someone had erased me from my father's financial legacy with clerical precision. I tried calling the county office for clarification. The woman on the line spoke in a gentle, practiced tone, the way people do when they've been instructed not to answer questions directly. She said the records were complete and sealed. She said the transfer was processed, according to available documentation. When I asked for copies of the original forms my father would have submitted, she placed me on hold. 5 minutes passed, then 10. When she returned, her tone had shifted, cooler, measured. She told me respectfully that the documents were no longer available for public access. That was when I understood something important. This wasn't a clerical error. This wasn't a miscommunication. What I was looking at had been planned. I hung up the phone and let the silence settle around me. The room felt colder, as though the truth itself had lowered the temperature by several degrees. My father had trusted Noah with many things, but not this. Not the entire retirement fund. Not in a way that removed me from the equation entirely. That went against every principle the man lived by. I reached for the second folder, Ohio Property Family Home. The old farmhouse had been the pride of our family for as long as I could remember. My father built the porch with his own hands, repaired the roof every spring, and carved his initials into one of the attic beams when he was 19. It was the place that held our earliest memories. Creaking floorboards, the scent of old maple trees in summer, the heavy quiet of winter storms. He told me once, long before he died, that the house would be split between us. Equally, he said, that's how family stays intact. He believed fairness was the closest thing to peace a man could leave behind. So when I saw the updated property deed, dated 3 days after his funeral, listing Noah as the sole owner, something inside me went still. The deed was signed, notarized, and filed with the clarity of a process executed quickly and quietly. Too quickly, too quietly. There were annotations in the margins referring to revision upon death that I had never heard of. The witness signatures belonged to people I didn't recognize. One of them was illegible, the scrawl of someone trying to imitate formality. I turned page after page, looking for some sign of error, something that would explain the impossibility of it. My father had not been buried for a week when this transfer was filed. He had been on life support longer than that. There was no window of time for him to make such a change. Someone else had made it for him. My pulse hammered in my ears. I stood and walked to the kitchen, needing distance from the documents that had rewritten my life without permission. I poured a glass of water but didn't drink it. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the dawning realization that the manipulation had begun long before I ever suspected it. Noah had always been charming in a way I wasn't. He knew how to navigate conversations, how to make people feel comfortable, how to persuade without appearing forceful. He married into a family with connections, lawyers, executives, people who understood the quieter corners of paperwork. I had always called him lucky. Now that word tasted bitter in my mouth. I returned to the office. The sun was setting through the narrow window, casting a thin blade of orange light across the desk. The retirement forms looked almost peaceful in that glow, as if pretending to be ordinary. But the truth was already written plainly enough. The man who called me in the night, the man who wore my father's face, had not reached out without reason. Someone had stolen his legacy. Someone had forged his final decisions. Someone had erased me from the family line. And whoever did it had done so with the confidence of a person who assumed I would never look closely. After that day, the world felt different. Every interaction with Noah carried a new weight. Every unanswered question from the county office added to the quiet dread building in the corners of my mind. I began to see patterns, the small, deliberate ways in which power shifts without making noise. The financial violation was not about money. It was about rewriting truth. And as I stood in the dim room holding papers that proved I had been removed from my own family's history, I knew this was only the beginning. When a betrayal becomes undeniable, there is a moment, brief but unmistakable, when shock gives way to clarity. It isn't anger. It isn't grief. It feels more like a quiet click inside the mind, as though a gear that had been jammed for years suddenly shifts into place. After discovering the forged signatures and the altered deeds, that click happened in me. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the steady resolve of a man who had finally accepted that no one was coming to explain the truth. If answers existed, I would have to find them alone. I had spent most of my life avoiding conflict, believing that measured distance preserved peace better than confrontation ever could. But the silence my family had wrapped around me wasn't peace. It was concealment. And concealment always leaves a trail, no matter how carefully someone thinks they've hidden it. The strange clue that cracked everything open came from an unexpected place. An attorney in Santa Fe I had never met. The message arrived as a voicemail late on a Tuesday afternoon. His voice was calm, formal, with the clipped cadence of someone accustomed to delivering information without emotion. Mr. Langford, this is Richard Salazar. I'm an estate attorney in Santa Fe. I've been trying to reach you regarding a dormant trust listed under your father's name. It appears you're the primary beneficiary. I'd appreciate a call back at your earliest convenience. A dormant trust. My name. My father's name. I replayed the message twice, then a third time, letting each detail sink in. My father had never mentioned any property in New Mexico. Never spoke of investments outside Ohio. His finances were always transparent, simple, practical, predictable. He had once said he didn't trust money he couldn't see. And yet here was a trust tied to parcels of real estate in a state he rarely visited. The next morning I called the attorney. His tone remained measured but contained a quiet undercurrent of curiosity, as though he too sensed something amiss. He explained that 5 months before his death, my father had updated a will, one separate from the documents processed after the funeral. This version, tucked away in a private law office 3 states away, listed me as the primary beneficiary of several land parcels. Parcels with steady rental income. Parcels no one in the family had ever mentioned. Your father was unusually specific, the attorney said. He left instructions that these holdings were not to be consolidated with the primary estate. They were to be contacted only directly to you. A silence stretched between us. Mr. Salazar, I asked, has anyone else contacted you about this trust? My brother? His wife? Anyone from my family? No, he said. Only you. And to be frank, there was a note attached that suggested your father expected interference. Expected interference. The words settled in my chest like a stone. Something inside me, something I had suppressed since childhood, tightened and straightened itself. After the call, I didn't speak to anyone. I didn't reach out for confirmation, didn't ask my family why they hid this. Instead, I let the new information fall into place beside the forged signatures, the missing documents, the sudden coldness from relatives who had no reason to avoid me. My father had known. Not everything, perhaps, but enough to prepare pieces of the truth before it could be erased. That night, I sat at my dining table long after the lights in the neighborhood had dimmed. Outside, the street lay quiet, the houses dark, the air thick with the kind of stillness that feels like a held breath. I opened my laptop and began the work I had avoided for years, tracing back every thread of my father's estate. I combed through real estate archives, property transfers, public filings, retired pension statements. At first, it felt like stepping into a labyrinth. But slowly, patterns emerged, small inconsistencies that formed a quiet map of exploitation. Money that should have gone into the estate maintenance fund had instead been rerouted through two shell companies. Both companies were tied to a consulting firm owned by Noah's wife. The transfers were listed as operational reimbursements, but there were no attached invoices, no ledgers, no corresponding expenses. Just unexplained withdrawals bleeding through the estate like a slow siphon. It became painfully clear this wasn't incompetence. It was orchestration. The deeper I looked, the more deliberate it became. Dates were edited, records backdated, clerks' signatures mismatched. Even the county staff who had been so evasive began to make sense. Someone had guided them, someone had nudged them toward silence. And all of it pointed toward the same conclusion. The estate had been rewritten quietly, almost surgically, to remove me from any claim of inheritance or authority. For the first time in months, I felt something unfamiliar but grounding calm. Not the numbness that comes from shock. Not the frantic searching of early grief. A steadier calm. The kind that comes when a man finally decides he will no longer remain the one acted upon. I hired a forensic estate attorney the following week. A woman named Evelyn Mercer. A quiet professional with the kind of focus that made people underestimate her. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her questions spared no detail. She examined each document I had collected, flipping pages slowly, methodically. After an hour of silence, she said one sentence that confirmed what I already suspected. You're dealing with long-term fraud, not impulsive, methodical. I looked at the stacks of papers laid out across her polished table. How long? I asked. She tapped her pen against the altered deed. Years. Possibly before your father's health declined. It was strange, the way the truth settled in. Not like an explosion, but more like the steady descent of snowfall, covering everything, reshaping the landscape quietly. In the weeks that followed, I moved deliberately. I didn't confront Noah. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't reveal what I had learned. I froze verification access on all shared assets. I requested official reviews of every deed tied to my father's name. I filed inquiry after inquiry, giving no indication of the real purpose behind them. Every move was small, deliberate, quiet, like sharpening a blade in a room where no one notices the sound. I began waking earlier, sometimes before dawn, sitting in the dim living room with my father's old watch in my hand. It didn't tick anymore, but the weight of it grounded me. He had carried integrity the way some men carry armor. I understood now that the video, the trembling face calling my name, had not been a hallucination or a technological trick. It had been a warning, a plea, a final attempt to drag buried truth into the light. And slowly, quietly, the power began returning to me. Not through confrontation, but through clarity and preparation. There is a point in every quiet battle when momentum shifts, not because the conflict ends, but because the person who once stood unsteady begins to stand differently. Straighter, firmer, unafraid of knowing. I could feel that shift taking hold in me. No more unanswered questions. No more silent acceptance. No more standing at the edges of my own family's story. Whatever my father had tried to warn me about, I was preparing to meet it head-on. Calmly, precisely, and with every piece of truth sharpened to a point. And in that quiet preparation, the reversal had already begun. There is a particular stillness that arrives the moment before long-hidden truth finally steps into daylight. It's not dramatic. It doesn't come with raised voices or sudden revelations. It comes with a sense of inevitability, like watching the last piece of a structure settle into place after months of quiet construction. When the day of the meeting arrived, I felt that stillness in my chest more than I felt nerves or anger. No storm was coming. The storm had already passed. What remained now was the unveiling. The downtown bank where the confrontation took place sat beneath a skyline of pale winter sun, the glass facade reflecting the muted glow of a city half awake. I stood outside the entrance for a moment before going in, watching my own faint reflection in the doors. The man looking back at me seemed older than the one who had sat in that restaurant weeks ago, watching a grainy video tear open the ground beneath him. But he also looked steadier, like someone who had finally stopped running from the truth. Inside, everything was polished, sterile, softened by the quiet hum of conditioned air. Receptionists moved with practiced precision. The marble floor reflected passing silhouettes in faint, ghost-like outlines. People came and went with small envelopes and quiet urgency, unaware that a fracture in one family's history was about to settle itself in one of the bank's private conference rooms. The meeting had been arranged by the bank's compliance division, a review they called it. Routine. A chance for everyone involved in the estate to present documentation. I knew better. So did Noah, and so did the relatives who arrived wearing polite expressions stretched too tightly across their faces. They took their seats around the long mahogany table, a tableau of familiar shapes arranged with forced casualness. My brother sitting with a confidence he hadn't earned. His wife examining her phone as though it contained answers she needed to memorize. A few cousins who had stopped returning my calls months ago. All of them positioned themselves as observers, not participants, as if ready to applaud the outcome they expected. None of them greeted me. The compliance officer entered last. A quiet man in a gray suit, mid-50s, carrying a tablet and a stack of printed records. He surveyed the room with the impartial eye of someone who dealt in details, not emotions. He sat at the head of the table, glanced at the agenda, and began with the practiced calm of a man who had done this 100 times. I listened without speaking. He reviewed the estate accounts, the property transfers, the existing deeds. He noted discrepancies, small ones at first, dates misaligned, signatures mismatched, filings rushed through without required confirmations. Noah shifted in his seat each time the officer paused to clarify a detail, but said nothing. He believed the weight of his facade, the confidence he had worn for years, would carry him through. Then the officer turned to me. "Mr. Langford," he said, "you submitted supplemental documents for review." The room went quiet. Noah looked up, for the first time truly aware of the shift. I reached into my briefcase and placed a thick folder on the table. Not dramatically, not forcefully, just deliberately. The sound it made against the wood was soft, but final in a way that silenced even the smallest movement in the room. Inside the folder were the documents Evelyn and I had compiled. Property filings, time-stamped financial trails, digital archives pulled from public servers before anyone could erase them, certified notarizations collected over weeks, screenshots of the shell companies, cross-referenced signatures, comparative handwriting analyses, the unedited will from Santa Fe with the attorney's affidavit attached. Every page carefully organized, every piece of truth sharpened with quiet precision. When the officer began examining them, his expression changed. Not surprised, not alarmed, but focused. He asked for verification codes, and I slid them across the table. He entered them into his tablet one by one. Each code unlocked confirmation of authenticity. The silence in the room deepened. Then, as he reached the revised will, my father's real will, he paused. "This contradicts the documents we received after Mr. Langford's passing," he said. No one spoke. "It also restores primary authority to you, not your brother." Still, no one spoke. Noah's confidence faltered. It didn't collapse. It simply thinned, like a veneer beginning to crack at the edges. He leaned back, as if searching for some composure that used to come easily. But the facts laid out before him were no longer flexible. They did not bend the way people did. They did not adjust themselves to charm or familiarity. Facts simply existed, and they were all pointed in one direction. The officer continued, his tone growing more formal. "These documents demonstrate unauthorized transfers, forged signatures, and financial activity that raises compliance concerns. Effective immediately, all access to the estate accounts, personal or through holding companies, will be suspended pending full investigation. The words hung in the air like a quiet, steady toll. No raised voices followed. No dramatic outbursts. Just a stillness that settled across the room as though the walls themselves were exhaling. I watched Noah process the reality he had never imagined confronting. His face paled slightly, not from fear, but from the abrupt collapse of the quiet power he had grown accustomed to assuming would always be his. His wife looked down at the table, her composure finally slipping. A cousin shifted in his chair, suddenly uncomfortable. Not one of them looked at me. The officer then slid the reinstated will toward the center of the table. "This," he said, "is now the governing document of the estate." There was no argument to be made, no loophole to exploit. Everything had been authenticated by third-party verification, sealed by legal timestamping, backed by the very system they once believed would conceal their actions. My father's intentions, buried, overridden, manipulated, were restored to what they had been before anyone had touched them. The meeting ended without tension. No one spoke as we stood. The officer shook my hand with a professional nod, acknowledging neither victory nor loss, only the completion of his task. I appreciated that. There was dignity in simple execution. Outside, the winter sunlight caught the edges of the buildings, casting long reflections across the concrete. The air felt clearer, lighter than it had in months. I walked out alone, the quiet falling around me like a soft, familiar cloak. No triumph rose in me, no satisfaction, just a steady release, the kind of peace that comes not from winning, but from setting something right that should never have been wrong. My father's voice from that midnight video no longer felt like a haunting, felt like a beginning, and for the first time since that night, I felt the ground beneath me settle into something steady again.